The Sega Genesis was my console of choice during the early 90s. Most of my friends had one, and it was the system that I played the most. So, yeah, I went through and looked at my own collection and picked out the 15 best games that I could find from them. So here is the list. This is the best boxing game on the system, by far. The controls are solid, the graphics are excellent, and it's just a ton of fun to play. And I like it a whole hell of a lot more than Buster Douglas's Knockout Boxing, which feels like a really awful version of Rock'em Sock'em Robots. In this game, you can create your own boxer, which was pretty awesome, and you slowly climb up the ranks until you fight Evander Holyfield. You start relatively weak, but as you fight, you gain money, and you use that money in order to do different training things, like have an all-protein diet, or start running, or jump rope, and that'll change your stats in whatever way you want them to be changed. So you can kind of customize your boxer as much as you possibly can in the game. This is one of the games that left a big impression on me, and I absolutely love this game. Also known as Bare Knuckle 2, Streets of Rage 2 is the best beat 'em up on the Sega Genesis. It's got quite a bit of competition, but this is the one that I think is the best, not only from the Streets of Rage series, but from all of the beat 'em ups on the system. Streets of Rage 2 takes place shortly after the first game. The evil Mr. X, who was the bad guy in the first game, he's back to take over the city again, and this time our heroes are joined by Max, who appears to be inspired by Hagar from Final Fight. I found Max to be the easiest character to play, and even though I still prefer Axel, Max is a lot of fun to just go through the game and beat the crap out of people with. This is a spectacular beat 'em up. The controls are great, characters are fun, and the game is a lot of fun to play with your friends. It's one that I played quite a bit in the 90s. On a system that's not really known for RPGs, Shining Force is a standout. It is one of the first tactical RPGs, and it took a lot of inspiration from something like Fire Emblem. Well, I prefer Fire Emblem, and especially Tactics Ogre, to this one, because it sort of feels like a bit of a hybrid between a regular RPG and a tactical RPG. This game is really great. Shining Force offers a lot of fun. The story is great. Some of the tactics are... Well, the gameplay is a little bit lacking on the tactical part. If you're coming to this from if you're coming to this from Fire Emblem or any of the other tactical games, you might be a little shocked that flanking your enemies doesn't matter, but it is a very fun game with a really gripping story. It's just a great, great game. I was not expecting to have a licensed game like The Punisher be one of my favorite games on the system, but it is one of the best beat-em-ups on the Sega Genesis. This was a game that I didn't know anything about. Unlike the Streets of Rage series, this actually was an arcade game, and it's pretty awesome. The Punisher is a great property for a beat-em-up, because he is kind of an over-the-top violent character. But you can also play as Nick Fury, which is a whole nother thing that I don't really want to get into, and I talked more about when I did a review of this game. But this is an excellent beat-em-up. The graphics are wonderful, they're on par with the arcade game, the controls are very good, and it's just a really fun game to go through, especially when you start picking up weapons and just shooting people with one of the Punisher's guns. It's great. Sega was really relying on their arcade ports to kind of carry the day early on, and the Golden Axe series was one of those sets of games that was really helping out the Sega Genesis. It's also a series that I felt like had to be on this list. I like the first Golden Axe, but the second Golden Axe is the one that I like a lot more. It's a wonderful beat 'em up. It has a high fantasy setting instead of the urban one from Streets of Rage, or kind of an over the top one like the Punisher, or the weird stuff like Alien Storm, where whatever, I won't get into that too much. But of the Golden Axe series, I think this is probably the best that's on the Sega Genesis. Most of my memories of Golden Axe 2 came from playing it in the late 90s when I was collecting games. And yeah, I think it's a very good game. I might have swapped this out with another one, but I really like Golden Axe 2. Now we get into Mutant League Hockey. I love the Mutant League games. Mutant League Hockey was one that that a friend of mine rented a lot. And it's an over-the-top hockey game where you can kill the other team in order to win the game, or knock them into the water and whatnot. It's a very hard game to score goals in, but it is a ton of fun to play, especially once you get into it. With the remake, the remake of Mutant Football League, I really hope that they bring back the hockey as well, because Mutant Hockey League is a ton of fun. It's a very arcade sports game, which is a genre that isn't really used too much anymore, but hey, it's absolutely spectacular. To keep that going, Mutant League Football is also really great. Wow, sorry, I'm trying to get all my words out here. Another arcade sports game. It also is very over the top and can be somewhat violent. Not as violent as Mutant League Hockey, and definitely not as violent as the remake that was made a few years ago. But Mutant League Football is a ton of fun. It ended up spawning a cartoon series later on, which I wish would get re-released in some ways. But anyway, I really love Mutant League Football. It is just a great and wonderful game. When I was writing this up, I had no idea what to call Toe Jam and Earl, so I just called it an adventure game, but I have no idea how to actually classify this into a genre. It's one of the stranger games that I remember playing as a kid, but it is also one of the best games on the Sega Genesis, just because of the way everything's set up. It is absolutely bizarre. You play as one of two aliens, either Toe Jam or Earl, and you are making your way through a version of Earth in some ways, and you're trying to find different pieces of your spaceship so that you can get back home. Not every level you go to will have a piece of your ship, and you won't know if there is a piece there unless you get off the elevator and it says, special hint, there's a piece somewhere in this level. As you go through, the enemies get more bizarre and more violent or aggressive, and you just have to try to get around them. You collect presents, and those are your power-ups. It is just a wonderful game. Definitely play the remake of it. Once Nintendo's monopoly on third-party developers was ended, Sega Genesis fans got one of the best games on the system with Castlevania Bloodlines. This game was exclusive to the Genesis, which is wonderful. It doesn't look as good at times as Castlevania 4, but it is the game that I prefer over Castlevania 4. You don't have the same amount of control as you do in Castlevania 4, but that never really bothered me. I like this plot a lot more than gathering the body parts of Dracula from Castlevania 2. And in Castlevania Bloodlines, you get more of a selection. You can choose between one of two characters in your quest to defeat Dracula and the people who are trying to resurrect him once again. The game isn't very long, and the backgrounds can be a little boring at times, but aside from that, the controls are good, the graphics overall are good, and the gameplay is wonderful. If you were wondering what an open-world RPG might look like on the Sega Genesis, this is the game you're looking for. Shadowrun is a cyberpunk tabletop game. Or, sorry, it's based on a cyberpunk tabletop game. Wow, okay. And Shadowrun is that open world RPG that kind of reminds me more of something that you would play on the computer than anything else. It's an action RPG, which at times can be very frustrating, but it is really a lot of fun once you get into it. You basically get dropped off in one of the areas of this futuristic version of Seattle, and you are running jobs that lead you all over the place as you try to kind of uncover the mystery and the reasons behind your brother's death. Who tried to kill him? Why? It's a lot of fun once you get into it. Okay, let's talk about NBA Jam now. I got a lot of sports games on here, but that's because the system was really known for it. The NBA Jam port is, in my opinion, better than the Super Nintendo version. NBA Jam is wonderful. It's one of those games from the 90s that a lot of people remember. It was in the arcades as well. I don't remember the arcade game, but that's besides the point. It's a 2-on-2 basketball game that is very much an arcade game, and it plays a lot like an arcade game. There are no fouls in the game, but you do have some violations like goaltending, which I remember very well. The thing that I remember most about NBA Jam is the Blockbuster World Championships, and going to a local Blockbuster and playing this game to try to move on, which I didn't, but it was still a lot of fun. Phantasy Star 2 is the first Phantasy Star that appeared on the Sega Genesis, and it is one of the best RPGs of the 90s. The story was much more mature than some of its contemporaries. The graphics were much better than the other console RPGs at the time, and overall it was a really fun game to go through. It picks up long after the events of the first game. The AGL system has changed significantly since Dark Force was defeated the first time, but guess what? He's back, and he's also infected the computer system that controls everything in the solar system. And you need to go through and kill him. This was a game that I really hadn't tried or put a lot of time into until the 2010s. Once I started playing, I found it hard to put down. There were just so many unique games on the Sega Genesis. The Haunting is one of those. This was when EA actually cared, and they took chances and released games that were going to be a lot of fun instead of just pumping out the same sports games every year and the same licensed properties that they give up on because they don't make as much money as some of the other ones. I don't like EA that much. But in this case, and also in the next game, they created something really special. The Haunting is a isometric adventure game where you travel around and scare the living hell out of the family of people who have wronged you in some way, like creating a defective skateboard that killed you. And so your response is to harass them until they eventually leave all of the houses that they try to move into. It is way more fun than it has any right to be. Arcade games and strategy games don't necessarily go together, or at least they shouldn't work out as well as General Chaos does. This is another game from when EA actually cared, much like the Mutant League games as well. But General Chaos takes the idea of a game of capture the flag, essentially, and gives all of the characters guns, or explosives, or flamethrowers, or some way to kill each other. And you know they die because they turn into skeletons. You move across a map in this, and you can select different units in order to fight against each other. The goal of every one of these maps is to wipe out the other team's soldiers. It's a lot of fun. What you do is you control the movements of the characters and when they attack and when they don't. You can also call for medics to come and get them. It really is a very fun game that really shouldn't work as well as it does. Now we get into Phantasy Star 4. This is the best game on the Sega Genesis by far. It is the best RPG on the Sega Genesis. It's arguably one of the best RPGs of the 90s. I really do put this game up there with like Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, and Final Fantasy VI as being one of the best retro RPGs. Phantasy Star 4 was the last game in the mainline series, and it tries to link all of the other games together. And I think it does a pretty good job of doing that. It even somehow brings in Phantasy Star 3 and gives you a reason for why that game exists. So everything about this game is just absolutely spectacular. The graphics are wonderful. They've really perfected the comic books sort of cutscenes that they have here, which I wish more RPGs of the time had done. The gameplay is spectacular. I just love everything about it. It's not just one of my it's not just the best RPG on the system. It's one of my favorite RPGs, bar none. I feel like I needed a few more minutes to talk about Phantasy Star 4, but I'm not going to do that. I've got a whole review of it where I probably ramble on for much longer than a minute and 20 seconds or however long I went on for. So that is my list of my favorite, or not really my favorite, well, I guess it is, my favorite and the best games on the Sega Genesis. This system means an awful lot to me. It was probably my favorite system of the 90s, and that includes the PlayStation and the Super Nintendo. I didn't play that many Super Nintendo games in the early 90s, or even in the mid-90s. It wasn't until I started collecting that I played a lot of SNES games. But I played a ton of Sega Genesis games all throughout the 90s. This was the first system that I actually collected for when I discovered that I could go out and just buy a bunch of retro games. That was in the late 90s, and I grabbed a ton of games for it back then, and I continue to collect for it now, but in a much more selective capacity. I'm not just buying anything anymore. Anyway, that was my list of the greatest. That was my list of the best Sega Genesis games. If there are some that you think I missed or left off, just leave them in the comments below. And thank you very much for watching. I'll talk to you all later. Bye.